you have to stand out with an undeniable value proposition. You got to spend a lot of time there, and then teach your sales reps, your marketing, like really spend time for them to absorb it, put it into their processes and live it with their customers, and then keep checking that.
The Industrial Growth Institute podcast connects you with the big thinkers, makers, and subject matter experts across all aspects of an integrated B2B industrial revenue growth function. From strategy, board oversight and transactions, through all the phases of manufacturing marketing, the complexities of industrial sales, and the nuances of marketing and sales technology and customer experience, I speak with guests who bring insights, innovative perspectives, best practices, and twists on traditional approaches. Each episode explores high-level thinking and in-the-weeds actionable tactics. If you enjoyed these discussions, then please help me out by liking and sharing the podcast, and especially by leaving a comment and giving a review. So with no further ado, let's jump into this episode. Hi there, I'm Ed Marsh, the host of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. One of the revenue growth challenges that industrial companies face is the perspective of leadership. Most company leaders are boomers or early Gen X, and that Gen X title applies to me and to my guest today. Al Rosenbaum has a career in sales. In fact, he was in tech sales before tech sales was a thing. He started at Hewlett-Packard. He spent years in communications. He had a stint at Fidelity where he turned Boston Coach into a SaaS model, and he started his own consulting firm called Shift to Convo a couple of years ago. He's a guy with tons of sales experience, someone who might legitimately be able to, use the expression, he's forgotten more about sales than some of us have ever known. But here's where the perspective thing comes in. Sales training is so completely different today than when he and I started in our careers. And it's almost hard for guys of our generation to wrap our heads around how sales training is approached or ignored today, as we're going to talk about. Al started at Hewlett-Packard, as I mentioned, known for kind of, along with Xerox and IBM, as having phenomenal sales training organizations. So he's got that original background. I'm sure during our conversation today, there's going to be some whining about how things have changed and how they are, but I think also a lot of wisdom. So everyone, please help others learn about this important topic. Like, share, comment, subscribe to this. And join me in welcoming Al Rosenbaum. Hello, Al.
Hey, how you doing, Ed? Thanks for having me on today. Really happy to be here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think it's a little bit different than some of the others. We're going to dive into some different angles than I've talked about with other folks. Let's start with kind of setting the context. You and I graduated college around the same time. You started selling a couple of years before me because I spent some time in the Army, but it's been a lot of years. And you've had a number of jobs, and sales has changed a lot. So give us the context. Take us through your career highlights so we understand where you're coming from for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, and in reference to training, when I came out of school, I'm really going to date myself here. When I graduated college in 1989, I had worked as an internship, I had worked for an HP distributor or reseller at the time, selling hardware, mostly PCs, the HP printers, things like that. So I was introduced to sales, but through a very small reseller that was on Western Massachusetts. And, to your point, in my first job, I was sent to sales school for 9 months before I was out in the field.
There's a lot of salespeople who turn over after 9 months in a job, though.
Right. It just shows the times, right? I mean, and you mentioned IBM and Xerox. IBM's program was a year. Xerox was, you went for, I think it was a year, went out to the field for a few months and came back for another 6 months. Wow. That's how much training they got. But when you really break that down, when you ask the question about my perspective, name me a company today that's doing it anywhere close to that.
Yeah,
right. Just spending an amount of time teaching people how to sell.
We're going to get into that.
Going to sell their product and anyways, but that just to put it in perspective, I mean, there's no one doing that today. And a lot's changed since 1989 in technology, our culture and norms, and just probably thousands of other variables that have changed as well that we won't even be able to get into today.
Absolutely. So for that succession of jobs, was there kind of a consistent thread that you followed through them? I know there was some communications, and then there was some tech, and then a lot of fintech in the end. What kind of, if you describe the arc of your sales career, how would you describe that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually the arc of why I started Shift to Convo, because what I noticed along the way, there's a lot of important things to do as a sales leader with your sales team to get them ready for the situations they're in. There's all kinds of sales operational things that need to be set up properly. It's when you break it down, it's people, process, technology.
Right.
So there's all kinds of technology and a process around that technology in sales, a process for sales in general. I mean, you can go to all kinds of training classes and learn about sales process and all that fun stuff. But when it comes down to the people part of it, what I've noticed that makes the most significant difference, and I was lucky in my sales leadership roles. I worked for 7 different companies. 6 out of 7 of those, the goal was to grow from X to Y and sell the company.
Okay.
And 6 out of 7, we did that. And the number one thing I noticed that really made the difference, or that was common, I guess, across all of them, was that um, the sales team really needed to know how to have the right conversation around their value proposition and tie it to what the prospect was trying to do. And in most cases, if you're selling higher ticket items, it better be what the CEO of that prospect is trying to achieve. And that's where I think there's a big disconnect in sales training today. It's that it's not just, how to have those conversations connected to the CEO, but what specifically is your value proposition that and I call them problem statements and hero statements. Like, what common problems do you solve, and how do you make those prospects a hero that solve problems they're being asked to do from their CEO typically. And that's the part that I find that gets missed most often. But when it's hit and done right, that's how I got to 6 out of 7. That's where I focused a lot of my time and effort through those different assignments I had along the way.
All right. So the bottom line up front then is there's a lot that's changed about sales and sales training that we're going to talk about, but there's also some absolute fundamental axioms, if you will, of successful B2B sales. And among those is talking about the outcomes and problems that matter to the CEO, to the company, and not dwelling on the product specs and details. Is that fair?
Yeah, and you don't dwell on the product specs and details. Just to dwell on them, you've got to be able to, if you're going to bring up something that your product does, then you got to know what uniquely it does that's different than anything else out there that solves some root cause or delivers some outcome
Right.
that executive decision maker cares about.
And
That's the only product spec or discussion about the product that matters.
Right.
Up front, you've got to frame what your product does. And that's a really important aspect as well. Because if you're going to ask a lot of questions, then you still have to frame your solution a little bit, because people need to know, hey, what am I answering these questions in context to? But when you're going to bring up product information, it's got to be relevant to, I find, some root cause or some outcome or some combination of those that you're addressing.
So that's an interesting point that we're going to come back to. This habit of salespeople who have not been well trained, that hear that they need to ask questions, end up kind of shining a Klieg light in the eyes of the prospect and setting off on an interrogation. So asking questions without tying the context to the business outcome. So definitely, that's a thread that I want to pull, come back to it.
Yeah.
Now, we've got a mutual friend, John Paniccione. I think one of your stops along the way, you worked with John at Logic Bay, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's kind of an interesting use case, because you were selling technology to industrial companies. So you're bridging those two worlds.
We were actually in that when you mentioned I've been selling tech for quite a while, those were the early days of SaaS. And so the company was trying to transition from a services business. Their main service was that they were selling online training modules, right? Computer-based training modules. And they realized that to get the valuation that they wanted to get in the company and grow it, they needed to turn that into more of a SaaS offering. This was like the early 2000s when, sure, Salesforce.com was out, but that was like the only SaaS reference that most people knew about. And that's if you even knew about it back in the early 2000s.
Right.
So we were really transitioning it to a SaaS company. And so the whole value proposition was changing. And we had to really spend a lot of time on what our value proposition really was. And I don't mean some high level statement you just tell someone and they get excited, like really going through it in detail and figuring out, okay, what's the typical current situation that our target ideal customer profile is in most often? How would we describe that? And what typical impacts does that have to either profits or revenue or risk or customer experience?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the only four things that every executive is asked to manage, right? It's manage the revenue, manage the profit, manage the risk of the business, and manage customer and or the smart ones also pick a fifth, employee experience as well.
Right.
But so how does it impact that? And then we can go deeper and go, okay, well, what's the root causes that situation happens today in most cases? And that if eliminated, you could address the problem. And then, okay, now how does our product solve for those root causes uniquely and deliver that outcome that they're looking for, right? And so all the questions around those things, like their current situation, the pain in the current situation, the impact of the current situation, how it's getting in the way of what the CEO's asking them to do, and what's the root causes. Then, once we understand that, now we're playing doctor, right? Now I can start prescribing how I would solve for that problem. And that's when, to your point, certain capabilities of the product or things around the product I've noticed, Ed, too. For example, in that particular example that you bring up with John, we had a portal that had an online learning tool on it that these industrial manufacturers could use with their dealer network, with their reseller network, to certify them either in sales or in fixing a particular piece of machinery.
Right.
And we had lots of features in that. But we also built custom content for them that they didn't have, that were gaps. So we brought the old service into it. But a lot of people wouldn't even consider that the product, right? But there was a service offering that was optional that they could use. They could put their own content in, or we could create it. And if they put their own content in, we could help them make their content better. Well, that's like something unique that we did versus just offering some software product that we installed for, or some SaaS product that we set up for.
As you talked through understanding the buyers and their needs and matching the product value proposition to it, you sound like a marketer who's trapped in a salesperson's body.
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up. I noticed with some salespeople and sales leaders, and I even noticed this with CEOs I've worked with and work with today with Shift the Combo, that the expectation is if I want to double sales, I just go to the head of sales and the sales team and go, we need to double sales, figure out a plan, come back.
Double the number of spam emails you're sending out.
Yeah, right. So, there is a way to grow sales significantly through sales effectiveness, right? There's primarily four ways. I either need to increase the amount of leads coming in or, build more qualified opportunities. I can charge more. I could also shorten the length of the sales cycle, and I can convert better. Those are the four things I can do in sales effectiveness. And if I did 10% on all of those, an improvement versus where they're at right now, you should see a 48% or near 50% increase in sales.
Right.
That's a lot easier said than done.
Of course.
Number one, improving on all four. And, the other day, Ed, I was asked one of the best questions from one of my CEOs, one of the CEOs that I work with, and helping them grow their company. He said, Al, we're a relatively small company. We're 5 million in ARR, SaaS company, right? And all kinds of trials and tribulations over the last 6 years with, building sales teams and stuff like that. But in your experience, what really grows sales at a high growth rate for companies our size or, around our size? And I thought it was a great question. Like, what really does it? And what I said to him is, frankly, number one, it's an undeniable value proposition to your target market. Because if you put it all on the back of the salespeople, you better have the top 5% salespeople across the country, or else and otherwise, that's how IBM did it in the early days. But IBM's at a very different place today than a small company, right? They can have a different set of tactics. They have an army of people. They own double-digit spend with CIOs of major corporations, so they can get in to see that CIO of a Fortune 50 company, no problem. That's not true for most companies. So, but it really is an undeniable value proposition. And then, if you have the guts to do it, and you're going to deliver on those outcomes, guarantee the outcomes. Now, there's a way to do guarantees that isn't necessarily the outcome, because that can get a little tricky, but you can guarantee success in some way and really put your money where your mouth is. But the first step is undeniable value prop.
And that takes really understanding buyers. And if you leave that up to the sales team, it's not going to work. And if you leave it up to the one person in an industrial company who's the marketing team that organizes trade shows, it's not going to work. You have to have people focused on it.
You really do. Because the other thing, Ed, is what's different about when we started this conversation, right? Like what's different about 1989, let's just take the PC arena, all right? In 1989, in the PC market, there really wasn't any big players. There was IBM for corporate, and there was Apple for the home market, but the market wasn't that big either. It was just starting to really take off. I mean, it was big, but it wasn't as big like it is today. Well, in the next couple of years, all of a sudden there was hundreds of different manufacturers.
Gateway, Dell, I'm thinking of some of the names.
Yeah. Dell came on, and Dell wasn't even a big player initially, and then all of a sudden they became a big player, right? And they had a very unique value proposition. They could custom build your PC to order within a couple of days and ship it to you, which at the time was earth-shattering, right? Where the HPs and the IBMs were, no, you got to pick from this list. They would custom build to order, and they would build a really good, it was really good value for the money. It would be to your door in a few days, exactly the way you customize it. It'd probably be about 10 to 15% less expensive than IBM or HP or Compaq at the time when HP bought Compaq years later. So some people don't even know that name, but they became the number one player, pretty quickly, right? My point just being is they had a really unique value proposition, grew the heck out of it. I would say Dell almost single-handedly made IBM leave the PC market because of their value proposition. Not because they had great salespeople. They hardly had any salespeople. You just ordered online.
All right. So I want to make sure it's fascinating to talk about the wander down this memory lane of PCs. I want to keep this relevant for industrial companies. So the key thing here that I think we got to take away is value proposition. And we're going to talk about messaging. Let's come back to sales real quick. Of all those sales jobs you had, does one stand out as the hardest?
Boy, they're all hard.
Okay. All right. I buy that. Absolutely.
None of them were high flyers when I went there. That's why I, was asked to go there. I, built a little bit of a track record of, turning something around. But, when I look at the one you mentioned with Logic Bay, that was really hard. And it was hard because in selling to industrial manufacturers, we were selling to the Daimler, Chryslers, we were selling to high-tech manufacturers as well. But mostly it was Daimler, Chrysler, Caterpillar was a big customer. It was companies like that who had large dealer networks that they either primarily or had a significant amount of their business going through some kind of reseller channel. They might have had a direct sales channel as well, but they had a distributorship or reseller channel. And what was key to them was you were going to, at the point of contact with the customer, if you were selling through a reseller, the way you sold it and the way you serviced it really differentiated the product and gave success. So obviously training and certification of that was important. So we understood that part of the market. And you got to remember too, back then, this is in the early 2000s, online wasn't a new thing. Like they knew you needed to do a lot of this online. You needed to start, that's when the internet was obviously out at that point, and growing rapidly. But, there was a real need to start putting training online and doing certification online versus, human-led, instructor-led, face-to-face
flip
training.
charts.
Yeah. That one was a tough one, though. That was a tough assignment.
And as you look at the arc of your sales career and now the companies you work with, is it fair to say the sales is getting harder than it used to be?
Oh, yeah. It's getting harder to get in the door, and it's getting harder to differentiate.
And so obviously the internet plays a role in that. Is that underlying all of the increase in difficulty, or are there other factors at play?
I think there's some other factors as well. And there's probably thousands that we're not even going to think about today. But I think there's some other things. So the internet has played, right? I can go get information and do my research on the internet today. And it's even just in the last year or two, just think about ChatGPT and what you could do there and all the knockoffs from that and how you can do research today. Second thing I would say too, though, is, when SaaS was really growing, in any market, whether it was manufacturing or anywhere, banking or anywhere. When you look at the early 2000s, everyone wanted more tech, more tech, more tech, almost for the sake of just more tech. Well, guess what? Then COVID hit and, budgets got reality and, hey, we have 3 CRM systems today, we're going to 1, right? So there's almost a reduction in tech. So for the tech world, selling to anyone, there's so many options that are out there. And I'm sure the same thing happens in industrial and manufacturing, right? Just think about the car market. There's so many different cars I could buy. And there's so many different types of fuel sources for those cars now. That wasn't around, when I was growing up, when you were growing up, there were the big 3 and Toyota came in and Honda came in the 70s. Right. That was it. It was the big 3 and those 2 in the United States. How many car manufacturers? You got the big 3 still. You've got Toyota and Honda still. You've got Hyundai, Kia. I'm missing a bunch there. You've got Tesla and all the electric manufacturers that are spread. Just think about all the options they have. So there's just a lot. There's just a lot more options that they have, and then there's only so much that any company can absorb when they're buying stuff. There's only so many projects they could do. Right. So there's all kinds of options, but still only have this many projects I could do in a year to install some technology or do something. Right. So you've got to just be even. I think it's just harder because the first question in any prospect's mind when you're trying to sell to them, you've got to get a meeting with them. And the first question that needs to be answered is to get the meeting from their point of view, not your point of view. Theirs is, why should I stop what I'm doing and take a look at this right now? Do you have a really good answer for that? Right. Do you have like things that are really typically tied to what the CEOs of the industry you're selling to, that you do to help tie to some of the outcomes they're looking for in a particular industry that you're focused on selling to? Then if you get through that, then you get those initial meetings. You got to build enough excitement, because the question that's on the prospect's mind, whether they're saying it to you or not, the second question is, why can't I do this with what I already have or some cheaper alternative? Mm-hmm. And it gets to these other variables. There's so many other alternatives, right, and they could be far less expensive. I mean, there's, if you look at it like in a knowledge management world, right? There are so many options there's Microsoft SharePoint to Chat GPT for your company, customized for your company, and then everything in between, and all kinds of lots of alternatives. Right. And then the third one is, once you get later in the sales cycle, is the juice worth the squeeze? You've got to be able to prove to them that, or they've got to be able to buy into the fact that not just for the money we're going to spend, which is part of it. The bigger issue is, what's the disruption to my organization? Yep. And so those unique capabilities have to address number 3 quite a bit, or else you're not getting across the finish line.
Yeah, and
right?
these sophomoric ROI calculations that I see salespeople do. Oh, well, you're going to save 0.7 people, it's going to cost you this, so you pay it back in this time. Never consider buying additional spare parts, shutting down production, bringing in riggers to move machines around, pouring new footings under the floor to put in new machines, all the kind of stuff that goes into it, all the extra overtime to bring third shift in for training during the day, all kinds of stuff like that. It's huge. Right. The other thing that you mentioned that really resonated with me is all of the other things that companies need to spend time and money and resources on. And salespeople tend to think they're selling for the selection as a vendor. But long before that, they're selling for whether this project even gets attention, even gets consideration, then whether it gets capital allocated, then whether they get selected as a vendor. There's all these, I often talk about 5 decisions that have to happen along the way, with the vendor selection being the very last one.
Absolutely. Jimmy, you nailed it, right? Like, going back to those 3 questions, like, why should I stop and look at this right now? You may be calling on a prospect or a suspect. They're not even a prospect yet. You just, you think they might be a suspect. You got to see where they're at relative to a solution like yours. Have they already decided they're buying something and you're just one of the people they may consider? Or is there still some convincing that needs to happen that this should be a priority? Well, if there's still some convincing, you're in a different sales campaign than you are if it's just figuring out which vendor to partner.
And even if you're at that vendor stage, if they have something like all their Microsoft machines shut down because of CloudStrike, like happened last week, and their business is disrupted for 2 months, doesn't matter where you are in the process. Guess what? It's not a priority. It's not happening.
Exactly. So I just think that the speed of companies today, yes, they're moving so quickly. There's so many options they could choose from. The noise is so great. It screams to me that, it wasn't like when I'm selling for HP, everyone knew who Hewlett Packard was. It wasn't hard to get into the CIO.
Right.
You take a company, brand away that, may not be known like an HP or an IBM or Xerox in the day, not the same, but if you were going to look at copiers, Xerox was on your short list every time, right? It wasn't hard to get in the door. Well, that's not true today. There's a lot of technology companies, vying for this business. And boy, your value prop better be nailed down, and you've got to be able to train reps to use your value prop and not assume, hey, I sent them to Dale Carnegie and they've now all been sales trained and they know how to use it and all these different, that's not, assuming the sales team's just going to figure that out is a huge mistake and a wasted opportunity for training.
So back to perspective, as I was preparing for this discussion, I was thinking about when I got started. I got out of the Army. I wanted to learn sales. I took a job with a company called Cintas that at the time was really just focused on uniforms. But there was a ton of culture. It was run by a former Marine. There was training, there was rehearsal, there was drill, there was coaching as part of what we did. And there was a very structured training program that also included routine small group stuff with role plays and ride-alongs. And we had group reading assignments and discussions. And that's when I read Spin Selling, for instance. Early on, my sales manager had us read that. He had actually sold into the auto industry for years, and he'd even done residential sales to couples at home. So he had a wide variety of background experience and some crazy stories, but an incredible talent for coaching. And that kind of set my expectation. I assumed that's what companies did. And then I ended up taking a job with a smaller company that still had a very strong sales training culture. And that's actually how I met our mutual friend, Dave Curlin, who had just moved on from Sandler and set up his own operation. He hadn't yet written Baseline Selling, but when did you meet Dave and in what context?
That's a great reminder too, because I met him when I was working for John Panichone, selling to the industrial companies, and what you're referencing from Dave Curlin is the Objective Management Group, and I want to tie it back to what else is impacting things today. A sales rep's belief systems either gets in their way or helps them in different situations. And that's what Curlin's assessment looks at. And that's why Curlin left the Sandler Group. And he was going to be the heir apparent taking over that company. Sandler tapped him as, you're going to take this over from me and keep it going. And Dave quit as a number 2 man there and started Objective Management Group because he realized not all salespeople are trainable.
Right.
And so he went on a mission to see why is that and which ones are more trained. It started that way, but what he really found was there were certain belief systems that just get in salespeople's way. And so they never execute in a way that is going to be successful for their particular market.
Right.
And he would expose that so that if you were going to hire a salesperson, you wanted to make sure they had the right belief systems. So if you are going to even train them, they're trainable. Because, for example, if they had low commitment, which would show up on the assessment, low commitment means I'm willing to do what I'm willing to do in order to get a sale, whatever I'm comfortable doing. High commitment is I'm willing to try new things and do things that are uncomfortable for me and learn new approaches to selling, or change my way in a particular deal because situationally I need to do that, even though it's uncomfortable for me. The people who had high commitment did 3 times better than the people who didn't. So like that could be getting in the way.
Yeah.
Right. But that's probably always getting in the way.
I had Ben Tego, who's the new CEO of Objective Management Group, on as a guest a couple of weeks ago. And he dove into that stuff in detail. And I'll drop a link to that episode below this one in the show notes because the stuff that Al's talking about is absolutely critical. Going back to the prevalence of sales training, it used to be just expected. Some companies did an incredible job, like you talked about, year-long courses. Some embedded it in the culture, but it seems so rare now. We talked about why sales are getting harder, how buyers have changed, but why have companies, as sales has gotten harder, why have companies drifted away from sales training?
I think one of the reasons being is that as things started speeding up so much, when I came out and you got trained for 9 months or a year and a half, those big companies realized that was a big expense.
Mm-hmm.
And so if their competitors, when it was easier to sell, when their competitors didn't do that and just kept taking those people who were already trained and just teach them a little about their product, well, they didn't have that expense. And so they could lower their price and have a Me Too product. And with technology, whether you're in high tech sales or industrial sales, technology speeds everything up
Right.
and really creates really tight pricing measures today, right? There's no big cost leader in most markets. And so if you had a big cost in sales training and your competitor didn't, and they were just rating your people, then they abolished those programs. So then no one did it
Got it.
because they didn't have the time and they didn't have the money and budgets to do it. So there's very few companies that are willing to put a lot of money and time and budget in there. And I think it's most of the CEOs just expect that salespeople they hire know how to sell it.
Which is such a crazy expectation. I mean, you don't hire a CFO unless they've got an accounting degree. But as somebody that can fog a mirror, you hire them for sales because you had a nice conversation with them. I don't get it.
Yeah. And so exactly. And so sales is a discipline like every other discipline. And so, I've never seen a natural born salesperson, never seen a natural born doctor, never seen a natural born accountant or a natural born engineer. You may have an affinity towards one of those, but you still got to learn the craft.
Right.
And you've got to learn the craft relative to in sales, what specifically you're selling.
And the kinds of buyers you're selling it to, and the nature of the market, and the complexity of the implementation and the implication to the business on making a mistake, all those things factor into it.
Yeah. The other thing I've noticed that is a variable as to why it's different today is the customer's environment is so much more complex. So you have to be an expert, not just on your product, but how it impacts all these other technologies and peoples and processes in that environment that is so much more complex today than it was in the late 80s, early 90s, right? And it was pretty complex then. It had already grown from complexity from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? Tech was starting to boom. But where tech is today is light years ahead of where it was before. And I'm not just talking about high-tech sales.
Which means that a rep has to have business acumen in addition to sales skills, in addition to technical knowledge.
Yeah, and that market knowledge, like really know it, and then know how to orchestrate that together. And it's really tough.
Right.
It's really tough to do. So you have to be so committed to your craft and constantly learning. Like you mentioned earlier, like I probably forgot more about sales. Baloney. I would say I'm going to disagree with you on that one. I think I could spend 10 lifetimes trying to master sales, and I'd never master it. It is that complex, in my view. It's also what keeps me interested in it, and why I do it at such a late age. Is I love it so much because it's something new every day. I learn something new every day.
So speaking of learning and speaking of training, there's terms that I think are often conflated. I want you to clarify them for us. Training, coaching, role-playing, motivating, mentoring. They're all different, I would say. How do you define those?
So you said training, coaching,
role-playing, motivating, and mentoring.
Motivating and mentoring.
And if you think I'm wrong, if you think some of them belong together, or if I'm missing some, by all means.
I don't think you're wrong. I think training and role-playing, I think role-playing is a form of training. It's one I use all the time. I use it with all my clients. And I think role-playing is one of the best things you could do and incorporate it into your training curriculum. Because it doesn't matter if they, went through some course. What matters is, can they take what they learn in that course and apply it in the real world? What I like about role plays, and I love role plays in front of their peers, that's the hardest environment they're going to be in. So if you make that really difficult and, emotionally charged, that you practice what you preach. And so you really practice in a tough environment, and then it's a lot easier to do it real time. But no, I think coaching is what reinforces the training. And I think mentoring is what helps you, understanding the rep or that individual and where they want to go in their career, and helping them see how certain things you're asking them to do connect to that. Right. Which then, gets into motivation. Right. So they're all separate. But I'll tell you what I learned at John's company. When you mentioned John Panichone and that toughest one I had, they were training industrial manufacturers. They were at the core of them. They were really training experts. That's where John's background was.
Right.
That's how I met him before I went to work for him. He was the head of learning development for MetLife. But they had a good technology bit. And by the way, John's he was an ex-captain in the military. He was the first leader with 300 troops or 700 troops in the first Iraqi war 7 months before we declared a war on Iraq in the early, in the George Bush senior days. And fascinating guy. The guy's just a great leader. He understood the power of training and doing all that. But what his experts, who were learning experts, told me about learning is they said, if you give classroom style learning, there's roughly a 36 to 38% cognitive impact on that. Meaning, like, maybe they'll remember 36% or use, they'll understand or, just get it into their brain, but doesn't mean they can use it. Where the highest impact is either one of two things, and this is where cognitive goes to in the high 70s to mid 80 cognitive learning impact, is when the person you've trained, you might use some of those, face-to-face, flip some screens, get some concepts out on the table. But then when they have to role play with an expert or do it real time with an expert to help them and coach and mentor them along the way, that's when it really sinks in, right? Because they've got to be in the act of doing it, or they have to go teach it themselves. So another method I've used is, especially when I have, a sales rep or a sales leader who really wants to, do the training. Great. Here's the content. You go learn it and teach it. And both of those are in the high 70s to low 80s as far as cognitive learning, and meaning that you actually can, you really know it.
Right.
And so I think they're all separate, but they all obviously have a tie to each other. I use coaching and mentoring to really reinforce training or the like in the right behaviors to get to the end result that a sales team needs to get to.
And it seems like today, most sales management consists of a weekly pipeline review. Tell me what's going on with your deals. All right, let's update the close dates. And that's somehow sales management.
Yeah. But if you look at it, like, Ed, you and I we appreciate, where training and coaching and mentoring comes in, because we were trained, coached, and mentored early on in our career. And then things sped up and they just kind of threw that to the wayside. So a lot of the sales leaders I work with are younger than you and I. They're in their 30s and 40s, and they weren't brought up the way you and I were brought up. And so it's understandable that they don't have the same level of appreciation. It gets to what I notice is there's two types of sales leaders today, generally. I'm totally generalizing this. There's the sales ops leaders, right? They're really good with the tech and the operations and the processes and stuff like that. And then there's the coachers and developers, right? I usually don't see that in the same person. The smart heads of sales, the really good ones, realize which way they lean, and then their right-hand person is the other person.
Right.
And when you mix those two together, now you got people, process, and technology. You got a chance for people, but you got to appreciate that as a sales leader. Like, I'm not a good sales ops leader. In my 28 years as a sales leader, I made sure every time, and I saw this in my first sales leadership role, you better have a good sales ops person as your right-hand personnel, or else you're not getting it.
Right.
And that was like day one. I'm like, that's my first hire, because I knew I wasn't great at that, but I was good at coaching and mentoring and developing and also finding value propositions, like really going deep into that so that I can bring that out and help these sales reps really understand who they're selling to and finding out what those common challenges are. And then we would have an answer for those common challenges.
All right. So you may have answered this question then by talking about how you need both sales ops and sales coaching. I was going to ask, what's more important, management or leadership? But it sounds like, as you described it, the sales ops is kind of the management and the coaching is kind of the leadership.
Yeah, I think you can put that. I think there's some rev ops or sales ops leaders that are also good at leadership as well.
Mm-hmm.
But they usually tend to be on one side or the other, right? Like sales ops people generally, sales ops leader, they think process.
Right.
They think management. And let's say, I don't want to poo-poo that either.
Of course.
That matters.
Absolutely.
Process matters.
Right.
Right. We know that in manufacturing, right? Your process matters for your manufacturing, and it matters with the way you're running a sales process as well.
I've long maintained that the sales manager is the most critical role in success. So I'm talking about that person, regardless of the title. Sometimes they call it VP, whatever they're called, but they've got 5 reps reporting to them. I believe that's the most important role. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, and I think is what you're saying is it's the frontline sales leader.
Right.
That I agree. That is, if you're a frontline sales leader, regardless of your size of your company, and that's a different job than a CRO.
For sure.
Right. That is a different job. That role will, I find, if when it comes to the sales effectiveness equation we talked about, just pure, that's the most important role in the sales organization.
Right.
You don't have good frontline sales leaders, they're not going to know how to find good salespeople and identify them. They're not going to train and coach them. And so they're just going to be, pencil pushers.
And if you happen to have a good sales rep by accident, then a mediocre sales manager is going to drive them away.
If they're not careful.
Right.
One of the things I always did, and it was one of the learnings I had right before I met John Panichone, was from a previous company I came from, was we would rank our people as a D1 to a D4. And a D4 was someone who was just, he's a top 5% or she's a top 5% salesperson. They know how to do it. They don't need a lot of coaching and mentoring. You just got to help them remove obstacles and get the heck out of their way. Right? A D3 is someone who was a D4, but for whatever reason fell back. There could be a problem at home. They might have a problem with someone in the company, including their boss, to your point, right? And then there's D2s are people that are young and learning, and they show that they have the capability. But you got to spend a lot more time with a D2 and develop them up, because you can't have all top 5% performers.
Right.
Just not reality. And a D1 are the people you just want to get rid of right away. They're wasting, they're sucking the time. They're C and D and F players at least for your industry. You got to get rid of those people. They're a cancer in the organization.
And for that frontline sales leader, the sales manager, what do you think is an appropriate span of control? How many reps can they effectively manage?
That really depends on the number of deals and the complexity of deals. And it also depends on the maturity of their team. So could I have 12 or 15 reps if they were all super senior people that were all, really good performers and they just needed a little bit of help here and there? Sure. But if they were 12 D2s, no way.
Right.
Almost no shot. Right. So there's a lot of variables there to answer that question. It really depends on the maturity of the leader and the maturity of the team.
If I had to pick one number that I think would be, if I could only give one number across the board, I think I'd say 5, maybe 7.
Yeah. It's definitely not more than 8.
Right.
In the vast, if you're looking at it from a bell curve, it's probably 4 to 7.
Right.
That seems to be in the middle of the bell curve. It's 4 to 7. And there's exceptions on, it could be more.
Sure.
There's exceptions, it could be less.
How about methodologies, sales methodologies? Are there any that you have embraced over your career? Is there one that you find most effective now?
That's the other thing that Curlin brought out and taught me and mentored me on. He would show the stats, and this might ruffle a few feathers here, Ed.
Good.
And I don't know.
Let's go.
But he would show me the stats. This isn't his opinion. He would show the stats on this. He was brilliant. He's a brilliant guy with numbers. And about 50% of the salespeople across all industries in the United States shouldn't be in any kind of sales role whatsoever.
Right.
And then there's another 45% that are decent sales reps, but half of them are in the wrong sales industry because of their belief systems. Like, I had a really good friend who sold toys to the Walmarts and the Toys R Us, and that's a very different type of sell. That's a high pitch sale versus I have other friends who are like myself that grew up in tech sales, which is much more solution oriented, and you're doing a lot of Q&A, and it's just a different environment, right? Well, if I brought my buddy Steve into this solution selling, he would fail miserably.
Right.
Conversely, if I was, more of a solution seller and I had to do a high pitch, then I'd probably fail in that as well.
Right.
So my point is all right, then you got that other 45. Then there's the top 5% that could figure out how to sell anything, right? And they're the unicorns because they're not easy to get. There might be 5% of them, but they're already making lots of money. So They're not usually on the market.
Right.
And so my point on that is that you've really got to look at what type of sales role are you, and what do you ask them to do
Sure.
in sales for the level and type of salesperson that you're going to have on your team.
Right.
Because you could have the wrong person in the wrong seat. They could be a really good salesperson in another situation.
Absolutely. And a salesperson who is tremendously effective selling with that Hewlett Packard logo behind them might completely fail working for a startup.
Yeah. Yeah. If I was going to take a shot at a company, it would be Oracle. They got a lot of salespeople.
Right.
I haven't seen a lot of success when they leave Oracle. I'm not saying there's not good people but there's a lot of salespeople that earn their chops at Oracle in their small business group. Some of them can do it. Some of them can't. But yeah, Oracle opens up a door.
So one of the pros and cons of a sales career is that you have to work until you hit your number, however you define that. That means sometimes there's really long, brutal, unpleasant days, but sometimes there's a lot of flexibility. Over the years, how have you found it's most effective to use that flexibility to manage the stress, and what kinds of activities have you enjoyed as a way to escape from the pressure of selling?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been in it since I started selling when I was for another company, never in mind that I had my own business to get myself through college. My first real sales job was when I was a junior in college.
Wow.
So, and I'm 57. So I think I was 19. I was 19 years old. I just turned 19. That was my first real sales job. And I realized I loved it. That's the first thing I would tell you is that if you're in sales, but you don't love sales, you're probably not in the right career. So like you got to start at that foundational level. And I loved it. So, because to your point, you're going to have a lot of rough days, despite doing all the right things.
Right.
But me personally, I love that because that's what keeps me interested. I do find though that there are certain things like I found for me, what works really well is I'm a stickler about preparation. So, and I coach my clients on this. If we're going to figure out a new value proposition and how to really position your value proposition, then when we go to institute it into a discovery call to have with a prospect, or even just how we're going to outreach to that prospect to get them to take call. But let's just take the discovery call. We're going to prep out this call. I'm going to spend the time to really prepare for it. If you look at anything that NASA does, right? I remember listening to, I think it was Bud Aldrich on just like the whole Apollo missions. And he said, if you look at the Apollo missions, the Challenger missions and missions we've done since, ground control in Houston knows what the plan is for what the trajectory should be for that rocket ship, right? In every other second, it's off course. You don't see people at ground control freaking out. They have a plan. Okay, we went a little off course. Let's put it back on. Oh, we went a little off course. Let's put it back on. So you got to plan out your calls. And there's a really good methodology for doing that. You're asking me about sales. Like that's methodology you want. Plan out your calls. You got to know what the client's expectations, who are you meeting with, learn a little bit about them online today. You can go on LinkedIn and learn all kinds of things. You can Google their name, learn a little bit about them to build rapport and personalize your conversation. Two is, the other thing you prep out of the call is, what's their expectation for the meeting? Did you set up the right expectation? So many times they say, I want to see a demo of your product. Like, oh, no, we're just doing discovery too. Well, you didn't set up the right expectation. But if you did, okay, that's their expectation. And then what is your goal for the call? Like at the end, what's your number one goal? And then what's your number two goal? And if you have a stretch number three goal, make it a stretch number three. What's the goal? And that's the end in mind, not how you're going to do it. Then you can have your discussion topics or agenda. And then you better have certain launch questions around that discussion topic and agenda that gets you to your goal. So that's number one. Like, do you really prep out a call and think it through? And then when you execute it, you're going to want to reflect on it. And so these are things I do that when I prep, I feel like I'm in control on something that I don't have a lot of control of, right? But I execute more effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to win every deal. Your deals are like a bell curve. There's a bunch on the left-hand side of the bell curve that a monkey could have closed. There's a bunch on the right-hand side of the bell curve. You should run away from those deals because it's just going to suck up your time and they should be. But it's the ones in the middle the biggest belly of the bell part of the belly of the bell curve. That if you execute well and you plan it out and you really have a tight value proposition discussion going on with them relative to their pay, you can move more of those ones in the middle to the left by the end. And those are the sales reps that become the top 5%ers. That's why they're top 5%ers.
All right. So this is interesting. I asked you how you escape sales and relax and wind down, and you went into telling me how you perfect sales. So that
I lean into it.
that
Yeah,
may
because
be the answer to your question, that you don't relax, that you're always going full speed of sales. Is that the case?
yeah, because I told this to a younger sales rep later last week for one of my clients. I said, look, when you're in sales and sales leadership, you should assume your head's on a block every day of that week. So if you don't love sales and you're not committed to that level, your head's on a block. And despite your best efforts, that's always true. So it helps keep me calm in the job by planning and just getting better and better at my craft. Mm-hmm. But yes, there are things I do outside the job. Like I think in sales, you've got to be in really good shape. So I really watch what I eat. I pay attention to my sleep and try and do good sleep habits before I go to bed. I exercise 6 out of 7 days a week. My number one goal, and this is kind of me, this is just works for me personally, is, a lot of people say my number one goal is my kids. My number one goal is to make sure Al's healthy. And I live to that goal every day. Why I eat and how I exercise. And the reason I make that my number one goal is that's how I become a better sales leader. That's how I become a better husband, better father, because I am no use to my family if I'm not healthy.
But the discipline,
I as well just be dead at that point, because at least they'll get the insurance, right? So I make my number one goal off time is Al's health, because if that goes, you can't help your family, you can't help your friends, and you can't be a good leader.
But that discipline certainly bleeds over into the way you execute your sales job too.
It's a tough job, right? I've got to be alert on, like even today with I've got, lots of customers and they're all in different industries.
Right.
Kept on top of that, right? CEO's expecting a lot. And you've just got to be in good shape, or else, because it's a grind game, and it's a grind game and a thinking game, right? It's like baseball, the thinking game with, I'll say hockey, where it's 80 games in a season and then a long playoff, right? And you're skating for hours a day and they're rough games, right? I've got to think and do. So my brain and my body it's got to match that.
And so what do you do for exercise?
It depends on the season. I'm up here in the Northeast. So, in the winter, I tend to do more weightlifting, but to get cardio, I usually join a boxing gym or a kickboxing gym because it really keeps my cardio up. When we get into the nicer weather, I tend to do more things like get out and do mountain biking and gravel biking, but I try and keep the weights going. But it's every day. I take one day off. That's it.
Right.
And sometimes I don't do that.
Shifting back to sales, there's been a big trend in tech toward a BDR role, basically taking the prospecting away from sales reps and handing it to a junior person whose job is to get meetings for the reps. Seems like that may be winding down a little bit. Are you a fan of the BDR model, or do you dislike it? What do you think about it?
I'm a big fan of the BDR model when done right.
Okay.
But when done right. And I've played with this over and over again. And I'm not saying the BDR model is for everyone. However, first of all, let's go back to there aren't a lot of great sales reps.
And let me interrupt. I'm using lingo. BDR, business development representative. Somebody essentially either handles the leads as they come in or does the prospecting and finds things that they think are qualified, schedule a meeting, and then hand that off to a typical salesperson.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? And so what they're doing is they're answering question number one I mentioned earlier. Why should I stop what I'm doing and take a look at this? So as long as you have a good answer for that, and you can hire to the belief systems of that role, like you called it a junior role, it could be. However, they've got to be willing to prospect, right? And so anyways, I like it when you can set up a team to do that. And I've built a lot of companies that way. That was my preferred method, because what I realize is, A, I'm not going to get a lot of sales reps that are good. So I need to keep that team relatively small. And B, when I do have good ones, I want them working on deals. And what I notice is if I've got account executives or sales executives who, if they have a low pipeline and they know how to prospect, they'll prospect. But then they prospect, they build up their pipeline, and guess what happens? They're not prospecting for a while.
Right.
And so if you can have a BDR team that at least augments and maybe does 2/3 of the meetings, and they're working closely with marketing, I've seen huge success there. But there's got to be someone leading that team because that team needs more coaching and development than your other teams. So you got to have a full-time leader, and you got to check in every, a couple times in the morning, a couple times in the afternoon, which you don't do with senior, 20-year-old account exec vets, right? They tell you to kiss off.
Right.
But a BDR needs to be checked in with like quite a bit. So if
inherently they're also doing the most unpleasant part of the job all day long, so they also need more nurturing and encouragement.
They do. Yeah, and they need a team, right? Because you need some, brothers and sisters in misery and to bounce stuff off of, and they should be together in a team. But there needs to be a good leader of that team who really understands that process, is working very closely with marketing and with the sales reps. And every time that team member comes in or that team comes in every day, they know their mission, they know who they're calling, they know what they're going to say, they know they know the play.
Right.
And you've got to set up the plays and it's got to be straightforward for them. And if you do that, it works great. I would tell you, of the 6 out of 7, that was a big part of it. Get real clear value prop, and then how's the BDR team going to use that? And I would build those teams. And I've built them internally. I've built them externally with third parties, and I've done a combination of both.
So obviously, if you're building the team, that team has sat under sales. Often that team sits under marketing. What do you think about that?
I usually find that fails.
Okay.
Because it's really a sales role that works with marketing. And marketing just thinks differently.
Right.
And so marketing says, I want you to follow up this way. Well, is that way the way that, really works? Right. But it really depends on the leader. Like, I don't want to blame it on marketing versus sales, because that fight's been going on. Marketing has a different role. Marketing's there to just get awareness. When that awareness happens, how you follow up on that awareness matters. And that's a sales role, to sell the value of a meeting.
Let's shift gears to messaging. We talked about it at the beginning. I know that's something, the name of your company, Shift the Convo, obviously is around messaging. I think that's your primary focus now. And you talk a lot about what you call the cost of ineffective conversations. How do you quantify that cost, and how do you describe that?
Well, the biggest quantity would be, are you going back to the sales effectiveness, right? Are you getting enough initial meetings, right, with your target audience? And then are you converting enough of those into real opportunities? And a real opportunity is that prospect's going to make an active go, no-go decision, whether they're going to make one with you or someone else, or they're going to at least entertain this at whatever the decision-making level is of that product you're selling, with the powers that be that can decide on that, the economic buyer and the decision makers, to say, hey, should we make this a priority or not? And so I measure it that way. I measure it with basically, how many opportunities we're getting to the table and what's our conversion rate. And I'm just constantly trying to improve that conversion rate with the right conversations, right? Because as we mentioned earlier, most of your prospects are in the middle of that belly. They haven't decided to do it, and they haven't researched it completely. And if you can bring expertise and value in that discussion, you could get that on the docket.
All right. So I think essentially what I'm hearing you say is that if we did the sales math, if we figured the average deal size, the close rate, the number of qualified opportunities, the number of meetings to lead to that, working all the way back through, you talked earlier about increasing each of those conversion rates by 10%, for instance. And I think what I'm hearing you say is you believe that the right messaging in conjunction with the right training is the biggest lever to improve the efficiency of those conversions, right?
Yeah, I just want to define messaging for a second.
Okay.
The way I'm defining it is, you've got to understand what your value proposition is. But we all know in sales who've been in it for a while, you can't just go out and say, well, I'm just going to tell my prospects this message. You've got to ask them questions to lead them to the water, or lead them to the, you got to ask them questions to get them there. You can't just say, you need this because this is a big issue for you. Well, that's not how sales work, right? But so it's the conversation around the messaging is what I'm really saying. But you got to have really tight, you got to know what your unique value proposition is. Like, for example, at 100,000 foot level, bringing one of my clients recently through what I call my value guide proposition, my value proposition guide, in a series of workshops where we really pull it out of them, out of our customers. Um, I'm like, hey, what do you guys do uniquely? And I was defining different, things for unique. But what we landed on at 100,000 foot level is the completeness of their solution, right? It covers the whole business for it. And this is long-term care for nursing homes. And they have a data product, a data analytics product. So it's very complete, yet highly customizable for each owner of that nursing home. And that's the 100,000 foot messaging. But then, okay, we got to back that up. What are the proof points? What things do we do that allow that to happen? And why does that even matter, addressing a root cause and an outcome? So all that's what I'm calling the messaging, that value guide, and knowing that. And then you build questions around that, questions for the BDR team or getting in the door, questions that you're going to ask on a discovery, questions you're going to ask on a demo, questions late in the deal. And it's all around that value and constantly keeping that campaign going. Because in sales, when I have to sell to multiple buyers in one company, it's like running for class president in 7th grade of the student council, right? I've got to get different groups out on the playground. I've got to get that jock group, this group, the brainiac group. You got to get all the different groups to buy in, right, so that I could be class president, right? So you got to have multiple conversations to do that.
And you talked about the questions for discovery calls and the questions for later on. I know you talk often about conversations across the whole buying journey, and now you're talking about members of the buying team. And so this exercise in conversations and messaging may have, if the buying team's got 10 people and it's a 12-month sales cycle, there will be hundreds of those conversation points, right?
You got it. And what I'm going to ask the CFO might be very different than who I'm going to ask the head of manufacturing, right, versus the head of R&D versus the head of sales. Like, if your solution spans across, so they have different needs and different desires. And what I'm trying to do is light up each of them as a supporter. Right. And then I need at least one of them to be a champion. Right. And that's different than a supporter, which, that's a whole nother topic. But I've got different questions. And some of those questions are all about them, but some of them are masked a little bit to see, do I have a supporter here? Right. Do I have a champion here? You're right. Because you can't win a big deal, those big 12-month sales. You can't win one without a champion internally, because 90% of the sales is going to happen when you're not around. You need a champion fighting for you.
And
internally.
90% of the deals that you lose you're going to lose when you're not around either, because you don't know what's going on.
Right. And so you need a champion. Right. And in fact, more is better. You need lots of supporters, but you need champions that are willing to sell on your behalf. Supporters just in favor of your solution, but they're not willing to risk their career on it. You start selling high-ticket items, you're going to ask someone to stick their neck out a little bit.
So you talk like a marketer, you think like a marketer, but you execute and think like a salesperson, which makes me think this is the intersection. It really sounds like a sales enablement topic. Do you consider what you do sales enablement or not?
Absolutely. Yeah. And marketing uses what I do as well.
Right.
Because they've got to market the awareness of the common challenges, sure, of course, common impacts, right? And that's got to line up with, if a BDR or an account executive is making a phone call to get in the door, it's just got to line up all the way along. Eventually that customer story gets documented. It's unique to that customer, but it's all typically back to some foundation of, common challenges that lead to common impacts, that leads to common root causes, why those challenges exist, right, and then there's got to be something unique you do that solves for
it. There's a lot of passion. I hear that you love what you're doing now, but do you miss running a sales team?
No.
How come?
I did it for 28 years and I loved it and I don't regret it. But no, I don't really miss it. I get a lot of the coach. I really like the coaching as well. So I get to coach a lot still, but for those people that are sales leaders, what I'm talking about. Like that's a tough job. I did it for 28 years in the front line and as a CRO. In some cases, I had to play both roles when I was in smaller companies. And I just don't miss it after doing it for 28 years. I don't regret it. I don't, wish if I had to go back and do it, I'd probably be fine. But after 28 years, I've had enough from running a sales team. What I I would miss the coaching and the development and the value proposition conversations, but people know there's a lot more to the job than that, right? You're constantly trying to appease the CEO, board of directors. You got customers coming at you, you got sales reps, you got marketing coming at you, you might have product coming at you, right? And their expectations often are very unrealistic. I'm going to double sales by improving my sales team. That's not necessarily going to happen. You should have a good sales team. You should always be. But that's not, that alone isn't going to double sales.
All right. So I understand that you're not out volunteering for the job, but let's say you suddenly had a team of 50 people that, kind of an average team. What would be the first 3 or 4 priority things that you would work on?
Well, I would look at the data, and I would start looking at, if I had 50, laws of average tell me there's a couple in there that are highly successful, and I would look at the data, who was, and then I'd go ask those salespeople how they do it. And in some cases, I would find they just have the ideal customer base or prospect base to go after, and a monkey could have sold that. And I found that. Or I found no, they're doing it very differently. They understand what it's like to be a top 5%er and what it really takes to do it. And I would, instead of reinventing the wheel, I would copy that. And then I would try and get as many of the B players I would figure that out, figure out the value guide, figure out the conversations from them. I would document it, and I would train, coach, mentor, and measure on that. And then I would see, of the other 48 or 49 people, who wants to follow that play and who doesn't. And the ones who don't, they make a decision, right? They've made the decision that they want to do it their way because that's all they're comfortable doing. And that's when so if I had that process, I knew how to sell it, then I would just go find other people that have the right belief systems that just want to come in. I hear it all the time. When I hear on an interview for a sales rep job that, hey, do you have a real methodology and a way of teaching how to sell your specific product? I hear that a lot. It's the B players screaming for what I'm talking about. They're they know they're not a top 5%er. They want the playbook. How does it work? So that's the first thing I would do. Find it, use the data to find who the top performers are, see if they have a repeatable process, document the hell of that, document how they execute in that process in the conversations, then I'd go train and develop on the rest and measure them appropriately on that you're following that approach.
But I love your mindset. You're not talking about canning those that can't do it. You're talking about letting those people identify themselves because they're refusing to follow the method that you've laid out for them.
Right. If it's a proven method and it works and it's repeatable, that's a big assumption. So that takes a little bit of time to figure that out. But if you have that, you can prove that point, and then anyone wants to go against it, they got X amount of time to go against it. And then, okay, I don't need players that aren't going to follow the playbook of a proven because I know I'm not going to have all top 5%ers. Right. I know most of my team's going to be B players.
All right. Let's say that somebody's listened to this and suddenly they feel like Don has broken, and now they understand why they need sales training. How does a company go about finding a sales trainer and vetting them? I mean, there's so many out there, and so many of them are as mediocre as most of the salespeople.
Yeah. And I don't know that the training is mediocre per se. It's just there's 2 parts to the training. There's the general sales methodology, right? Like Dale Carnegie salesman, it's great. Pick another one. It's great. But how do I apply that specific approach or that approach in sales training to my product, my market? It's that part that I find is missing. It really has to be in one. And that's where, and I'm not trying to make a pitch for me. That's why I went to doing Shift the Combo. I'm there's a value guide exercise, and then you build conversations around it. And you build conversations for different personas you're going after, or different stages of the sales campaign, right? The early, the mid, and the late. And it's really combining those two, because if you leave that up to the sales team, you're assuming they know how to do that, and they don't. So I would look at, how do you help me really tie it to what I do? And if they're not thinking that way and they just want to do general sales training, I would run. Doesn't mean that it's bad. I'm not dissing their. It's not going to work. It's only going to work for a couple of people at best. And if you have 50, that's not a good use of taking everyone out of the field, putting them through that. Right. It's got to be, you got to show them how to do it how their methodology applies to exactly what you do. It's got to be deep. Does that make sense, Ed? Like, is that pretty clear? Like, that's my number one recommendation.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's good guidance.
Yeah.
You've got this encyclopedic sales knowledge. You talked about how you're always wanting to learn more. So where do you go to learn more? What podcasts or books or newsletters, or YouTube channels? What do you find is good?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I love podcasts because I do long drives to different places. I'm pretty active outdoors, so I might go mountain biking 2 hours away. I'm like, well, you got 2 hours. I will tell you, my favorite podcast to listen to, and that I learned the most about sales, if I'm being honest, is Joe Rogan. I'm a huge Joe Rogan fan. I find him interesting, the topics. Not necessarily when he's talking to his comedy buddies, though that's entertaining. More so when he's having a deep conversation with someone who's got lots of subject matter expertise, like an Elon Musk or Gad Saad is another one I love listening to on Joe Rogan. And here's why. I have never seen someone master the art of conversation and asking great questions and taking the time to learn about the subject matter expert he has in front of him. He really cares about getting their perspective on the table. And if you could just learn that from Joe Rogan, he is a master at it. And it has a lot to do with why this is how powerful Joe Rogan is now. The 2024 election, and definitely by 2028, will likely be dictated through Joe Rogan. That's how much influence he has. When you look at it, it's because he just cares about learning the person on the other side of the microphone's perspective and point of view. And especially when and he asks great questions and lets him talk, and he actively listens.
Right.
So I learn a lot from him, and it's a constant reminder. And he is at a level that, hopefully before I die, I get halfway close to that.
What speed do you listen at?
What speed?
Yeah.
The speed of the.
Yeah, so you can play podcast at regular speed, half speed, 2-speed. What?
Oh, I do regular. If I have a 2 hour drive and it's or an hour and a half drive, I'll listen to part of it on the way up, and I just want to hear the whole conversation. And I'm listening for, wow, what a great question. Look how he phrased that question. Look at how he really probed deep into the answer of that question.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned a ton. He is a master at it. There's other podcasts. There's other podcasts you listen to in sales and just whatever, but pay attention to. The most important thing I'm paying attention to in anything that I'm learning about is how do I learn how to find out this other person's perspective? Because when I learned, this is really going to date us as well, right? Zig Ziglar was who I used to listen to all the time in the 80s. When I was at HP, I had a company car. I was doing 50, 60,000 miles a year. I had every Zig Ziglar tape. I had like multiple booklets of cassettes
Right.
of Zig Ziglar. But one of the things that stood out the most was people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That was a famous quote by Zig, and he would point that out all the time. And when you really take that to heart and you go learn someone else's perspective and keep your product pitch to the back door, it should come out where they're begging you to pitch the product, but because you've asked so many good questions, then you're thinking about it the right way. So anything that teaches me that, go back and listen to Zig Ziglar. He's awesome at it. Plus, he's entertaining.
Right.
You can pull him out on the internet. Like, that's a great one to go to. But the other thing is, like, I just downloaded, it's hard getting in the door today, right? Whether you're an AE or a BDR.
Right.
And I work with different firms that will do outsource BDR roles too, right? And I work with a lot of different firms and different partners. Getting in the door is brutal today. Emails typically aren't working, except for those that know how to personalize them. Voicemails aren't working, except for those that know how to personalize them. So I've been seeing methodologies out there for personalizing emails, the voicemails, and how you do that. And we're getting great results with emails, and we're getting great results with LinkedIn, and we're getting great results with text messaging.
So specific resources that you can point people to?
Yeah, one of them is I really like this one method. I'm just going to pull it up real quick. The gentleman's name is, and I think it's $147 for this download. And I looked at it. I paid the $147, download. I'm like, wow, this is really good stuff. And I've been applying it with BDR leaders and sales leaders. It's called, I'm just looking them up. It's, the person's name, if you just Google Brian Lamana, so it's Brian Brian, and Lamana is Lamanna.
Okay.
And if you go to his website, you'll see there's downloads, and it's called the Systematizing Outbound.
Okay.
It's an awesome playbook that if you had your problem statements and hero statements, it'll teach you how to write them, but you know enough about problems that your customers have, and then make them the hero, not your product the hero. He teaches a great methodology for getting in the door using personalized emails, personalized voicemails, personalized texts, what you do on LinkedIn, what you don't do on LinkedIn. And you could create a whole highly customized conversation just for getting in the door with that and knowing enough about your value.
Cool.
And when you put those two together, man, so I learned his method, and then I applied my value, and I'm like, wow, that stuff just works, right? There's other, and if you Google him and you Google people like him, you'll find other good methods too that range from the free stuff is usually you get what you pay for. I thought for 147, this was a great value. You could spend 2,000 per sales rep and get really deep into the personalization. And there's plenty of companies out there that I think probably do a good job, but I haven't used them directly.
How about work patterns for top reps? You mentioned you're exercising at least 6 days a week.
Yeah.
Do you find you're most effective early in the morning? Do you block time for prospecting? Do you have habits that you've developed that you think you've seen other top performers have similar habits?
Yeah. Well, here's one of the things Dave Carlin taught me about the top performers. You know, whether you have a BDR team or not, if you're an outside sales rep and you have a BDR team supporting you, you should be prospecting every day. And it should be one of your top 2 priorities, which means it would be in your calendar. There would be a scheduled time in your calendar. So I used to love asking sales reps about prospecting. They all lie. You know, everyone lies in a resume and on a, it's just human nature, right? There's little lies that people tell. I'm like, hey, do you know, what do you think about prospecting? Like, oh, I do it every day. Great. What time? I do it every day in the morning. Cool. Open up your calendar. Show me. So the best ones do that. They have it in their calendar. And like me, my number one goal is health. That's in my calendar. This is when you're doing it. I look at my week and go, you're working out here, 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 and here. Same thing with prospect. Do you have it in your calendar? Don't move that calendar thing. I get there's going to be some exceptions to that. I got to go work a show this week, Al. Well, you're prospecting all week. And that means you're not going to have as much time with your opportunities. So, okay, that's fine. Or I have a lot going on this week with my opportunities. Okay, are you going to double up next week when you don't have as much going on,
right,
and make up for it so that you stay consistent? That's the discipline of sales. And the top 5%ers, that's what they do.
Right.
Some of the B players do it, but some of the B players need to be pushed to do it.
Of course.
As well.
Yeah. And I think
Right.
we all go through phases in our careers, and in a year we have times we're more on it, we have times we're less on it. It helps to have an accountability partner, it helps to have a manager. That, you know,
Right.
None of us are 100% all the time.
Yeah. So the other thing I do, Ed, with that is that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, if I've got 3 big prospect meetings this week, right? What's on my calendar to prep out those prospect meetings?
Right.
Schedule that time. It's not when I get to it. Your prep should be the top priority before that meeting. Right. So how you schedule your time, and that you actually do the right things and you schedule it in there to say, that's a priority. That's a priority. Oh, this other meeting, I'm going to push that off. It might be a meeting. Who knows what it is? It's just not a high priority.
Should a top rep be scheduling 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week? What do you think top reps are working?
They're working more than 40.
For sure.
If you want to make big money, they're more like a hard 50 at least.
Right.
I think and everyone's different on that too. I've seen BDR. The guy was 25, best BDR, by the way, became one of the best sales reps I ever met too. I was early in my career, right after HP. I went to a small company, and this guy, Brian Logan, he's probably one of the best sales reps. I've had thousands of sales rep report to me directly or indirectly over my career. Brian would stand out as top 3. He could, as a BDR, get 10 meetings a week, typically by just spending 2 hours a day.
Wow.
He was just phenomenal at it. And he wanted to be a rep. He's like, boss, I want to be a rep. Like, I'm getting 10. No one else is even getting 10. They're doing it full time. I'm like, cool, you earned it.
Right.
So you're still getting 10 a week, and then we're going to spend the other 6 doing. So I've seen people get like just put the quality into their prospecting and get that out of it. But I generally find for most people in the bell curve, 40's light, over 60's probably too heavy.
Right.
You're probably burnt out.
Right.
But you got to be able to go hard for 50 hours a week.
Right.
If you really want to, if your goal is to make $250,000, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, which I know plenty of reps doing that, plenty of top 5%ers, you're going to have to work because you got to work on your craft constantly.
Right. All right. I'm going to put your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. How should companies that want to potentially get in touch with you, see about maybe working with you, just learn more from you? How do folks get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think right on my LinkedIn, if you put in Shift the Convo, it's got my mobile number as well as my email address. And they could just either way, whatever way they'd like to reach out. But I really appreciate you doing that.
Sure. All right. Folks of our generation kind of have to understand how sales is changing. So as we wrap up here, just a couple minutes, what would you say is the thing that they need to understand and embrace about creating an environment for sales success for the team for the next 5 years?
Well, I got asked this question from one of my customers 2 weeks ago. What really matters in growing quickly, especially if you're a smaller or medium company, and it has to be that you have to have an undeniable value proposition. It has to stand out.
And do you think that will persist? Do you think it'll be the same 3 years from now, or will it be something different?
Yeah, because it's just like, do you think technology and the speed of play is getting slower or faster? It's just think about what ChatGPT is doing to sales and every other role in this country. And one of my clients does, AI for the IP, for the whole IP industry, right? Like there's so many patents out there today versus 400 years ago when it started, and it's just it's a quantum leap every day of new patents. It's just speeding up. It's such a fast pace. You have to stand out with an undeniable value proposition. You got to spend a lot of time there, and then teach your sales reps, your marketing, like really spend time for them to absorb it and put it into their processes and live it with their customers, and then keep checking that. Just because you think it's right, then go test it out by having these conversations and seeing what's changing, constantly reflecting on that with the sales team. That's my formula for success, and that's what's worked for me back in the early 2000s to now, and that's why I started Shift the Convo. It's like putting that in there because you're shifting the convo to shift your sales organization, but also your company. If you're having the right conversation in the sales, you'll know what to build in your product. As long as those conversations are being, that's great gold.
Right.
Of what you should be building your product, right? And you got to have the right conversations to do that, and it's constantly changing.
Well, that's a powerful way to finish. Thank you very much for your time, for sharing decades of sales experience, for being a little bit provocative and challenging some traditional assumptions out.
No problem, man. I'm happy to do it, and thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. I'm glad. So for everyone listening and watching, thank you. And please help others discover this podcast and these great guests and conversations like I've had with Al by liking and sharing and commenting. And of course, I'd love for you to subscribe as well. Thanks very much for listening and watching.